always found on the decimal or life experiment planets such as Urantia. I think they're talking about human inhabited worlds.
Well, you can have human inhabited worlds. It must be non-breathers or sub-breathers or super breathers or something like that.
I wouldn't know.
No, I don't either.
But they're not absolutely uniform.
No, not. I thought that was in it.
But they're generally there. There are 24 different ways in which secondary midwares can appear. And the way we got them was unusual and extraordinary.
That's funny.
Yeah.
And there's where that universe architect appears too.
Techniques. They don't allow for any fallacy. If it don't occur one way, it will another.
Yes,
It
if
has
it's
to
in the
happen.
plan. Yeah.
They don't burn the bridge behind them. There's always another.
You know, one of the statements I like about the midwares, to me it's very touching. If I can find it. That's going to be over any other place it should be. This is page 865, section 9. They're discussing midwares as the permanent citizens of Urantia. You see, we think of ourselves as the citizens of Urantia. But in the eyes of a planetary prince, let's say, mortals are hardly permanent citizens, are they?
Oh, he's not
This
here.
is sort of like being a coach and trying to build a football team. I'm symbolizing the football team as any group designed to carry out a project. And you're working with an order of being who grows to maturity in about 10 days, has another 10 days of function as a mature individual, and then sort of tapers off to death in another 10 days. How would you like to work with people whose lifespan was about a month? This is pretty short-lived, isn't it? And yet that would be, we should get it down to a week instead of a month when we compare the tour of duty of a planetary prince with the generations of men. We're here just long enough to hatch out, sort of find out who we are, where we are in our relationship to God, and we're gone. And the next generation is going through the same process, and it's gone. But these midwares do stay around for a while. The primaries have been here for 500,000 years, and the secondaries have been here for about 37,000 years. They're going to be here for a long time. They're permanent citizens. We're temporary citizens. And I find this paragraph very intriguing. Even the seraphim come and go, but the midwares live here. In the larger aspect, the civilization of Urantia is the joint product of the Urantia mortals and the Urantia midwares. And this is true despite the present differential between the two levels of culture, a differential which will not be compensated prior to the ages of light and life. We're a long ways apart, but we are going to converge. We're going to grow together, because this planet is settled in light and light. The Midway culture, being the product of an immortal planetary citizenry, is relatively immune to those temporal vicissitudes which beset human civilization. The generations of men forget. The core of Midwayers remembers. And that memory is the treasure house of the traditions of your inhabited world. Thus does the culture of a planet remain ever present on that planet. And in proper circumstances, such treasured memories of past events are made available, even as the story of the life and teachings of Jesus has been given by the Midwayers of Urantia to their cousins in the flesh. This whole story came out of Midwayer memory, basically. And what other memories do they have? Someday, I think, before the Midwayers leave this planet, they will sit down when they humanize, and they will write out the whole history of this planet. All that men have forgotten will be restored. This history I would like to read. Wouldn't that be a history to read?
Well, after you're gone, Bill, what would be the value of it?
I aim to read it up on Jerusalem. I want to know all about this world I was born in.
I don't know. I want to look ahead all the time.
Well, I want to look back too. I want to know where I came
I'm
from.
going to charge that off as experiences, see.
Well,
Nothing bad. I'm going to keep looking ahead all the time.
I got a curiosity because I think the more I understand the planetary history and other histories too, this again is a revelation of the outworking of God's purpose. You can study God anywhere in the universe. Maybe more the purpose of the Supreme, but that too is God's purpose. Just think, this would be an unbiased history. Nobody is grinding an axe. It's been written by the best human historians, and I don't think the best human historians live on this world. I think they're up there on the mansion world and on Jerusalem, and they're far enough away from the events of their time, which they personally remember, but now they're detached, and they can write from a superplanetary perspective. I'll bet you the best history of this world is available on Jerusalem. And someday, when I've got me a real vacation, I'm going down to the library, and I'm just going to shack up with that history. And I ain't going to come out till I've read it from cover to cover. And I'll bet you there's a lot of books up there.
You'll be able to read faster.
Yes. I'll have a better mind to comprehend it. It'll be written in a better language. I find it very helpful to my peace of mind to know what the human race has been up to for the last 6,000, 7,000 years, as far back as we can go. And then on back of that through archaeology. These were people, live people. They hoped, they prayed, they feared, they cursed, they cheated. They were good and they were bad, and they were indifferent, no points in between. As one historian puts it, it's Prevet Orton who abridged the Oxford medieval history. And a beautiful job he did too. He said, right at the very end of his conclusion, he said, as we look back, we can see how many bright hopes were dashed to pieces by the covetousness, the avariceness of men. We can see how many things failed that a few succeeded. In short, we can see how crooked and how perilous was the long trail upward. That's a great statement. And when you realize that, then you realize that times are not so perilous now. We just happen to be living now. That's all. It's always been tough on this planet, as nearly as I can determine through reading about the past. And that's why I don't get too excited by all the scare headlines or anything else. There's always been a Black Death. There's always been some war, or rumor of war. There's always been a plague, or a horde of barbarians moving in. Why, when they used to have union problems in the Middle Ages, they didn't strike. The workers moved in with their sickles and they decapitated everybody who got in their way. There weren't any capitalists left alive in the town. And they held the city until the Duke arrived about a year later with his feudal levy and smashed one of the walls down, and he moved in and then he cut the heads off of all the union leaders. This is labor disputes in Flanders, about 1100 AD. And even Hoffa isn't that bad.
Well, the laws don't permit him to do that.
No, we can see how crooked and how perilous was the long road up to. What a conclusion to a history of the Middle Ages. I think it's important because when you come right down to it, an awful chunk of the Urantia book is history, starting with the origin of Urantia and sort of ending with the development of modern civilization. That's where we came from. This is how we got here.
We owe something to our ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
The comforts we're enjoying now is a result of the hardships they experienced.
Right. I thought of it, JB, in terms of patience. There are so many men who dreamt good dreams, and they labored for these, and they died unfulfilled. And we have reaped where they have sown. I didn't earn freedom of worship. I inherited it. I didn't earn the right to be educated, even if my parents didn't want me to be educated. The law compels them to send me to school. What a break. I didn't earn the comfort and the pleasantness of life in America. I inherited all these things. I didn't earn the right to stand up and exercise the inalienable American right to complain about the government. You get put in jail for this in some countries. I can stand up and cuss out the President of the United States, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the House and the Senate, and the FBI if I want to. Nobody's going to put me in jail. What a liberty to have. Well, as the Urantia book defines loyalty, they do it very simply. How could you take so much and give nothing? I'm rich. I inherit. And I think about all these guys that live back there, and not only the guys that are recorded in history, but for every man who achieved something in history, there were a lot of little guys who backed him up and helped him. And I think about those little guys like us, sitting right here in this room. And I would like to thank them for what they've done. And I can't do it because they're dead. And all I can do is try to pay off on the investment. Which means I should be willing also to work, to sow, even though I may not have a chance to reap, because I have reaped much that I haven't sown. That to me is quid pro quo. I like our mid-wear cuts. I think they're very interesting.
No.
Well, I want to tell you something. This is, in my life, a very historic occasion. And one of very deep gratification because in my entire experience with this blue book, this is the first time any group of human beings has ever asked to have the forward discussed.
Well, I mean,
Well, boy, howdy, we're glad to be there first.
I have taught the forward under various stages of compression. I've used a kind of an intellectual Alamite gun to force it down people. I have done a striptease with the forward. I've made it ridiculously simple. And I've always had a captive audience. But you folks actually asked to talk about the forward. And well, all I can say is, in terms of the Bible, this hour has come. I'd like to do this, if I may. Would you let me try to give you a feeling for the forward first? And would you hold detailed questions until we've just taken an overview of the forward? I would like to try to communicate to you my feeling for the intent which is behind the forward. The forward starts out with an apology. It says that our language isn't very good, and indeed it isn't. And it says, we want to help you understand. You see, the secondary purpose of the Urantia book is the illumination of the human mind. Its primary purpose is the salvation of human souls. But the book makes an intellectual appeal because the book is in English. Therefore, it's got to enter our consciousness through mind. The foreword tips its hat in 2 paragraphs to the human desire to start from man and proceed to God. You'll recall in one of the papers where they first talked about Trinity Teacher Sons, they tell why they wrote the book the way they did, starting from God and proceeding outward and downward to man. They point out that if you start from man and go to God, this might be a certain way of grasping fact, but the truth would elude you. You don't start with consequences. You start with causes. You start with sources. And so they start this book talking about God. But there are 2 paragraphs here that start on page 1 at the bottom, in which very quickly they accede to the human yearning to start from the simple and proceed to the complex. In the last 2 paragraphs on page 1, they very quickly start with our world and go right into paradise. And then they add a few comments. Your world is one of many similar planets which make up the local universe of Nebadon. This, with similar creations, makes up the super-universe of Arvanton, from whose capital, Uversa, our commission hails. Arvanton is one of the 7 evolutionary super-universes of time and space, which circle the never-beginning, never-ending creation of divine perfection, the central universe of Havona. At the heart of this eternal and central universe is the stationary Isle of Paradise, the geographic center of infinity, and the dwelling place of the eternal God. Now, I submit that's quite a paragraph, isn't it? In just 8 or 9 lines of type, they start here and take you swiftly into the center of all things. This is their concession to the human desire to start from the simple and go into the complex. I think it's very significant that the foreword starts with a discussion of deity
and divinity. Deity, they define as a word which is larger than the word God, because God means a personal aspect of deity. Deity can be other than personal, as well as personal. The first half of section 1 in the foreword is nothing more nor less than a discussion of how deity functions. And they give us 7 levels on which deity functions. These levels vary from the quiet to the active, and they encompass all of the known, comprehensible functions of deity. Deity can be very quiet. Deity can also plan. And that means that there is a potential, a plan which will be fulfilled, a plan that will be consummated. Deity can be fraternal, as in the case of Father, Son, and Spirit. Deity creates and spreads itself out over creation. Deity engages in creativity in time as well as instantaneous creativity, because evolution is simply creativity in time, and evolution simply means that creatures go in partnership with deity. When a seraphim is created, she has nothing to say about her status. She simply is born as a full-grown seraphim. But human beings have everything to say about their status as finaliters. The evolutionary process is no different than the creative process, except the act of creation is slowed down, broken into many stages and steps, and the creature has the possibility of going into partnership with the Creator and of being co-creator of himself as he is to be. I think of the creative and the evolutionary aspects of deity as the outgoing aspects of deity. And I think of the supreme and the ultimate aspects of deity as the ingathering of the consequences of creation and evolution. When all finite creativity, when all finite evolution is summed up, it consolidates in supreme deity. And this is a concept that's quite new in the Urantia book. It's quite foreign to Orthodox Christian theology. It is not wholly foreign to Western philosophy. The concept of a finite God is encountered in Western philosophy. But usually when you encounter that concept, it is to the exclusion of an infinite God. Only in this book do I find the two concepts associated. In the evolutionary supreme being, the universal Father, who inhabits eternity and pervades infinity, is escaping from the terrible limitation of absoluteness. Through the supreme being, the universal Father vicariously can have the experience of having an origin, of having a time of growth, of knowing what it is to struggle. How could an infinite God know struggle except through a finite expression of that infinite God? As you see, God's love, his purpose, his energies, broadside throughout the finite level, in creation and evolution, then consider a bringing back together of all these things, and that is the supreme function of deity. And in the same sense, on the superfinite level, we have the ultimate function of deity. Because what the supreme is to the finite, the ultimate is to the superfinite, to the absonite. Not absolute, but more than finite. This paper This section goes on to discuss briefly what is finite, what is absonite, what is absolute. And I think the simplest way of looking at it is to consider time and space. If we're in time and space, we're finite. Those beings who are above time and space, but understand time and space, deal with it, they're absonite. An absolute being is timeless and spaceless. I can think of a practical illustration there. Jesus' personalized thought adjuster is a timeless being, a timeless entity. And you'll recall that when the Master put the command of all celestial forces into the keeping of his personalized adjuster, this adjuster warned him. He said, now I'll make sure that you don't move about the planet. I understand space. But he said, I want to warn you. If you want to do something that merely means an abridgment of time, I can't help you there, because I'm not conscious of time. This thought adjuster does not transcend time. This thought adjuster is timeless. Time has no meaning to the thought adjuster. This section goes on to discuss divinity. And it points out that there are many different kinds of divinity, qualities of divinity, but that the one thing which is characteristic of divinity is it is the cement that holds all the acts of deity together. If something is related to deity in any way, shape, or form, it manifests qualities of divinity. Elsewhere in the papers, the comprehensible elements of divinity are defined as truth, beauty, and goodness. We are told that these are unified in living personalities as love, mercy, and ministry. Elsewhere, we're told that God is love. We're told that mercy is love applied, and that ministry is mercy in action. An effort is made in the second half of this first section to open up our thinking in terms of the quality of divinity. And for the first time you encounter the permutation of three. There are 7 different aspects of divinity portrayed here. And if you'll stop and consider, this is the same pattern you encounter in the 7 master spirits. They point out that divinity may be perfect, relative, or imperfect. And then they let these associate. And you wind up with 7 different possible combinations. And I think if you think of 3 in relation to 7, you'll find this pattern more than once. Perfect in all respects, imperfect in none. Perfect in some respects, relative in other respects, imperfect in none. Perfect, relative, and imperfect, all in association. Relative perfection in all aspects, imperfect in none. Relative and imperfect in association, imperfect in all aspects. I would say in human beings you have an association of the perfect and the imperfect. The thought adjuster would disclose perfection of divinity, and a human being would be a rather completely imperfect entity, wouldn't he? You would have Alpha and Omega associated in man. Having discussed deity and divinity, this forward then goes on to talk about God. When we consider God, we are considering an aspect of deity. The personal qualities of deity. How can we best understand that deity can be other than personal? Well, the Universal Father is the Lord of gravity as well as the source of love. To use the word God loosely now, God has a different attitude toward the physical universe as compared with his sons and daughters in time and space. God could hardly love a spiral nebula, could he? A spiral nebula is not a person. God's laws of gravity, of motion, of mass would apply to the spiral nebula. God's attitude of love would characterize his relationship to man. When I think of deity, and I want to name the deity of God, I use the term the first source and center. I do not worship the first source and center. I worship that facet of the first source and center which is turned toward me. And this is God, more particularly the universal Father. I cannot worship that which I cannot comprehend or love. I cannot love the source of gravity. I can well love the Father of personality. Even God, though, has its aspects. God functions on more than one level. We are not told here, we are not told how God functions in terms of absolute perfection. But we are told how he functions in terms of relative divinity expression. We're told that he functions pre-personally, personally, and superpersonally. And when he acts in these three relationships, he acts in a different way. Pre-personally, he fragments. He produces father fragments. Our relationship to these father fragments has to do with just one class of them. They're called thought adjusters. They live in us as potential partners for the eternal future. When he creates, he produces sons, even as Jesus. And then he functions superpersonally. This is beyond personality. The pre-personal would be before personality. The personal, we understand. But then he also functions beyond personality. And here he neither fragments, nor does he create. He eventuates. The best thinking I can offer you on the word eventuate is this. An eventuated being, to me, is a being whose existence is inherently a consequence of a plan. I can illustrate this very simply. The universal Father does not create the brotherhood of creatures. He eventuates it, in a sense. Simply by being the father of each creature, brotherhood is inherent in the relationship of all creatures. I think we're stretching the word eventuate, but it's a good illustration. God does not create universal brotherhood. Universal brotherhood eventuates out of the fact of God's universal fatherhood. You cannot have one without the other. Don't make that go on all fours. The word God has more than one meaning in these papers. The word God is used with 7 different meanings. We are familiar with the first 3. God the Father, God the Son, and God the Spirit. We're not familiar with God the Supreme. This is the emerging deity of the finite level of existence. This is evolutionary deity. This is God in time, not God in eternity. This is God in space, not God in infinity. God the Supreme is not an infinite deity. God the Supreme is a consequence of the acts of infinite deity. God the Sevenfold is an association of deity. Our encounter with God the Sevenfold is in the bestowal of Jesus, a very real encounter. When Jesus said, "He who has seen me has seen the Father," He spoke as God and for God. And this is the truest illustration that we can apprehend concerning the function of God the sevenfold. God the sevenfold is God anywhere in time and space. God in action in the imperfect evolutionary domains. To us, the only God that we can comprehend is in the human bestowal of Jesus. And this is God the sevenfold in action. God reaching out from paradise to fellowship any creature at any level of existence, even mortal creatures at the lowest level of existence. What God the Supreme is to the finite level, God the Ultimate is to the superfinite, the absonite level, that level which always like the ham in a sandwich. If the lower piece of bread is finite and the upper piece of bread is absolute and infinite, then the ham would be absonite, transcendental, separating the finite from the absolute. God the Absolute would be the final expression of deity. God the Absolute would be the final experiential or comprehensible expression of the Father, as the eternal Son is the existential expression of the Father. Existential meaning that which comes into being by the inherent acts of God. Experiential meaning that which creatures have had a hand in, hence could understand. If God the Absolute could ever appear in fact and in completion, then through God the Absolute we might understand God the Father as infinite. This tells me that God the Absolute will never complete his growth, because we will never understand. The Father is infinite. We'll merely grow in that understanding. The third section deals with the first source and center. I'm intrigued with the fact that they speak of the first, second, and third sources and centers, but there are only two sections in these papers which use those captions. They discuss the first source and center, and then I believe over in paper 9 they discuss the third source and center. You see, God the Father and God the Spirit are quite alike, and they're both quite different from God the Son. The Father and the Spirit are personal, as is the Son, but they're also everything else besides being personal. They have many other than personal characteristics. The Son is personal and only personal. And that's why the Son can't fragment himself, as both the Father and the Spirit can. You can't fragment a personality. And the Son can find nothing in his deity to fragment, because there's nothing in his deity which is not personal. He is the full personal expression of God. The Father and the Spirit are equally personal, but they're also much that is other than personal. Hence, they can fragment themselves. And so you have Father fragments, and you have Spirit fragments. Son fragments, you will recall, come from the Creator Sons, not from the Eternal Son. Sun-fused mortals derive their spirit endowment not from the Eternal Son, but from the Creator Son of their local universe. In this third section, we are for the first time introduced to the seven absolutes of infinity. And we're told about the relationship which the first source and center has to these seven absolutes. And I think the easiest way to think about these seven absolutes is to think of them in terms of matter, mind, and spirit. The second source and center is the source of spirit. The third source and center is the source of mind. Not that there is not also spiritual ministry there. The paradise source and center, the eternal isle, is the source of all things material. and the controller of all things material. And then the easiest way to think of these three absolutes is as the reservoirs out of which the matter, the mind, and the spirit of the evolving present and the unexpressed future is coming. From the unqualified absolute come the evolving universes. From the deity absolute come the spirit beings which are being created and will be created. From the universal absolute, perchance, they draw upon for mind. I'm not so sure about the last one, but I'm pretty sure about the first two. But I think it's a good, convenient way of looking at this. Example, when a local universe mother spirit creates seraphim, they appear in what is it, unit formation, 100 and some odd thousand of them. It's a large number of seraphim. They don't come from nothing. They come from something. When a cloud appears in the sky, that cloud does not come from nothing. That cloud was there in the form of invisible water vapor before a change in temperature made it visible. These seraphim that are created were potential in the universe before the creative spirit, by her creative action, transformed them from a potential to an actual. The unborn of the next generation are potential in the germplasm of the present generation of living human beings. And if they weren't potential, they jolly well could never become actual, could they? This section makes an unqualified statement. There are 7 absolutes of infinity, but the first source and center is primal in relation to total reality. This is not polytheism we're studying, this is monotheism. There is only one infinite being. Others share his infinity and his absoluteness, but none takes precedence over the first source and center. God, the universal Father, is the personality of the first source and center. And then they discuss how God is related to the universe. And we see that God is not directly related to the universe except in one aspect. God is related to creation, to the universes, through his 6 associated absolutes, except in one particular. He is the direct Father of every personality in existence. All personalities derive that quality of being from the universal Father, and they are linked to the Father by the personality circuit. The other 6 absolutes do not participate with the Father in this bestowal of personality, with one minor exception. The infinite spirit, the third source and center, has the Father's proxy. He's the Father's attorney in fact, and he can act for the Father. With one minor exception. The infinite spirit, the third source and center, has the Father's proxy. He's the Father's attorney in fact, and he can act for the Father. But again, this is the delegation of creative power. This section goes on to talk about reality. They point out that the maximum reality which we can understand is a finite God. And let's face it, we want God to have a beginning, don't we? A beginningless God is really beyond our comprehension. The only reason we accept an unbeginning God is because it's ridiculous to have a beginning. Because if he has a beginning, who's his father? Who's his grandfather? Who's his great-grandfather? We have the choice between an uncaused cause or an endless series. Do you see that? And the endless series, of course, is ridiculous. The Greeks tried it. Back of Zeus, they had Cronus, and back of him, they had someone else, but eventually you give up. And you simply start with the uncaused cause. The section goes on to point out that conceptually we need a beginning. And though there never was a beginning, they're going to give us one in concept. But they warn us this is not a reality. To God, to deity, prior to any self-distribution, they give the name the I Am. And they say, this is a philosophic concept. This is not a reality. And the most helpful thing I can suggest to you to deal with that is this. We use the number 0 in all our mathematics. But you have never seen nothing, have you? You can see 1 of something, or 1.5, or 2. But you've never seen a 0 of anything, have you? And yet we think in terms of 0. And it's a most convenient concept in mathematics. 0 is a valid concept, but 0 is not a factual reality, only a concept of reality. Are you with me? The term I am is just as valuable a thinking tool as the term 0, but neither are factual. Nevertheless, they qualify. They say, now look, the I am may be a theoretical concept and a philosophic concession, but the infinite is not. The universal Father is the infinite. I think of the term first source and center as this. When you get down to the level of the 7 absolutes, and you want to isolate out the infinite, it is the first source and center. This is the infinite as manifest on the level of the 7 absolutes. Just as when you want to say, what is the personality of the first source and center? The answer is God. What name do we give to that personality? The universal Father. That is the name of our choosing. How could he have a name? He's nameless. In shorthand here, they tell you how the I Am distributed himself. They simply tell you, and this again, these are valid concepts, but these are not factual realities. They simply say that I'm going to use the word God to describe pre-God because it's a simpler way of telling the story. They simply say that God separated himself from total reality. And if he hadn't done that, there would have been no room in which anything could take place. Because how would you squeeze something in where God filled all things? God, as it were, contracted himself, and he can do this because he has will. What he contracted himself into is the essence of deity, at the heart of which is will. And what he left behind is the essence of non-deity, non-will. One of the greatest criticisms I ever read of the book of Genesis was written by a Zoroastrian theologian about 250 A.D. It's in the Pahlavi texts. And this Zoroastrian, in criticizing Genesis, says, God was not alone, because when God commanded, let there be light, in order for that command to have effect, there must also have been present an obeyer of commands. And I borrow that term from the old Zoroastrian theologian. The unqualified absolute is the obeyer of commands. When deity takes snuff, the unqualified absolute sneezes. Now, when God separates himself from that which is not deity, he still links himself to that which is not deity. This linkage is the function of the universal absolute, the conjoiner of the non-deity absolute from the deity absolute. And I think three links linked together is an excellent symbol for that relationship. God still fills all deity. And I think of God as contracting within deity, while at the same time he expands to continue to fill all deity. I think of God as separating himself from the Son, of conjoining himself with the Son, of constituting the Trinity as a thing that happens simultaneously. So that instead of one of these circles, you know, the three circles, just being full of God, this circle is now a triconcentric circle. It is full of the Trinity. And in so doing, God achieves companionship. He separates himself from absolute personality. And in so doing, he becomes the Father of the absolute person, who thereby becomes his Son. And if he can become Father of the absolute person, he can become Father of any person. He ceases to be the absolute person, but becomes the universal Father of the absolute person and of all other persons. At the same time that he does this, when he expresses himself absolutely as a person, he expresses himself absolutely as a non-person, and this is the origin of the Isle of Paradise. Or, to anthropomorphize it, paradise is the absolute machine which God built for the same reason that men build machines, to perform repetitive acts. The physical governing of the physical universes is a repetitive act, and God devised a flawless machine to do this job for him. Why should he personally attend to it when a machine, an absolute machine, can do the job? They tell us that reality in section 4 is, they're trying to point out that all is not spirit. These papers make some startling statements. They say, for example, God is spirit, but paradise is not. They point out that our direction Godward is spiritward, so that as we consider matter, mind, and spirit, the spiritual is the more real to us, because our growth towards reality follows a spiritual route. This is truth. This is not, however, fact. Energy, physical energy, is just as real as spiritual energy, but it doesn't have as much meaning or as much value to human beings. They point out here that reality can be deified or not deified. This planet is hardly deified reality, is it? But finalators have partaken of divinity and are a part of deified reality, creature parts of deified reality. They go on to point out that things may be either actual or potential. We are actual people. Children yet unborn are potential people, are they not? And of course you can have something in between. A good illustration of something which is neither actual nor potential, the brotherhood of man. Is it unreal? No, you can't say that. Is it real? Well, read any newspaper and you can determine that it's not really here, is it? It is a becoming reality, isn't it? It's in the gray area, the zone of becoming. Are human beings real? Yes and no. Until they fused with their thought adjusters, they're not truly real in the universe, are they? We're simply becoming citizens of the universe. Is a child an adult? Well, no. And yet he's not an adult, is he? He's a becoming adult. Or have you coped with teenagers? This section closes with a discussion of not spirit reality. It discusses the Isle of Paradise, where they point out that paradise is an absolute reality derived from deity, but it is not deity. And I think the best way of looking at paradise is it is the absolute machine which God built. And we can understand that because we build machines to do jobs. Somewhere in here, it's not in this particular context, it says paradise is not conscious, as man could ever understand the meaning of such a term. Paradise in some way is a knowing reality. Paradise is not mindless, but it does not have mind as we could ever understand the meaning of that word. You should think of paradise in two ways. Paradise is a place, the dwelling place of God, at the center of all things. It is our final destination in our quest for God. On paradise we will find God, and figuratively speaking, we shall stand before him face to face. Paradise also has a function in the universes. As the sun draws all things spiritual, as the third person draws all things intellectual, so paradise draws all things material. Paradise is the central governing power of the material universe of universes. Section 5 talks about personality realities, and it points out that personality comes from God, and that all reality that is linked with personality is associable. Pre-personal fragments, superpersonal beings are all contactable and associable with personality and personal beings. This is a part of deity reality, in contrast to the not personal, which can never be associated with the personal. Man has no fellowship with a rock, but man can have fellowship with an adjuster, a seraphim, or a transcendentler, given enough time to have contact with transcendentlers. And they would be super-personal beings. They sum up, at the end of this section, the functioning entity of a human being: body, mind, spirit, and soul. The body, our life mechanism. The mind, which we think with and confuse ourselves with. The spirit, which invades the mind, just as the sperm invades the womb. And the soul is the embryo that comes into origin as a result of that cosmic conception. The human mind is the material womb of the soul. The spirit that comes from the Father is the invader And when that invasion takes place, in about the 5th year of mortal life, something new begins to grow. And this is the embryonic soul that evolves within the womb of the mind. And this is the soul which has the capacity to survive death. They point out that personality is none of these things. The personality is not matter, not mind, not spirit. Personality is a fourth reality in the cosmos. Personality is that which comes from God the Father, not the Son, not the Spirit, unless the Spirit acts for the Father. And then they define Morantia, because the soul is Morantia. The soul is neither matter nor spirit. And the best definition I know of Morantia is, it is a fabric, the warp of which is physical, the woof of which is spiritual.
You said it wrong.
Well, it doesn't make any difference. One goes one way and one the other.
Warp, spiritual, warp, spiritual.
The
I was looking at it. I wouldn't be that smart.
Or
I was looking at it.
you might say that matter and spirit will not mix. They don't ordinarily, any more than oil and water will mix. But in the presence of soap, oil and water will emulsify. Morantia is an emulsification of the oil of matter and the water of spirit. Section 6 deals, in a sense, is a continuation of their discussion of paradise. As they have talked about personality realities in Section 5, they talk about non-personal realities in Section 6. They try to define some terms that they're going to use in talking about the physical, the material level of cosmic reality. They talk about force, energy, and power. And these are stages in the emergence of what we would recognize as physical reality. Force is the beginning. Energy is a stage of emerging, and power is a stage of having emerged. This ties in with their later discussion, starting with space potency, going on down through primordial force, puissant energy, gravity energy, and universe power. You might say that in terms of liquid water, this is good symbolization. When you look up into the sky and you don't see the water vapor up there at all you see is the blue sky with the sun shining. This would be like force. Now when it turns cold and you see the clouds form, this would be like emergent energy. And then when it starts to rain, you've got universe power. Now you can feel the wetness. Does that help? Force would be intangible. Energy, you'd sense it, but you wouldn't get your hands on it until it rained. Then you could feel it. They point out that mind always means somebody is doing something. There's administration if there's mind. Mind never is generated out of matter. Mind is put into matter. They talk about pattern, which is a very interesting bit of discussion here. They point out that pattern is a very real thing, but it's hard to put your hands on. We're very unhappy if we have unfortunate patterns. We call that being homely, being ugly. The whole beauty industry is built up around the improvement of the human pattern. Our forms are patterns. A spiral nebula is a pattern. A triangle is a pattern. And the reason that these patterns appear is because the universe is full of energy, material, spiritual. mindel. And the universe has personalities in it, and personalities are always trying to order the manifestation of energy. So patterns are always appearing. Elsewhere in the papers they speak of the forms of ascenders as being patterns which become increasingly responsive to the purpose and action of the inner personality. And I've long suspected that one of the main reasons we'll have for trying to grow in grace on the mansion worlds is, if we are ugly on the inside, we will jolly well look ugly on the outside. And the only Helena Rubinstein you can visit is the house cleaning of your own soul. And when you begin to be good on the inside, you will begin to look beautiful on the outside. This is even true in this. As you write, as the hand of experience writes on your face, the blank pages take on the aspect of your personality. I put it in my words, we can't avoid wrinkles, but we have a choice as to which kind, the frowning kind or the smiling kind. You can choose which kind of wrinkle that you choose, that you want to wind up with. The next 4 sections of the foreword are a discussion of experiential deity. And here they use the word experiential in contrast to the word existential. Let's see what the word experience means. It means that it's something that you learn by living through. And because of this, you grow in wisdom, you grow in judgment, you grow in capacity. This is utterly foreign to the nature of God, isn't it? How could God grow by any technique? Because God is infinite. How could God learn anything? God foresees. How could anything take the Father by surprise? Nothing could. God is beyond experience, isn't he? His nature shuts him off from all things experiential, directly. He might experience vicariously in thought adjusters, but never directly. And as it is with the Father, so it is with the Son and the Spirit. These beings are existential deities. They are beyond experience. They are without beginning or ending of days. The Father's infinity could hardly increase, could it? If he starts out as infinite, what can be added to it? Now, the Supreme Being, the Sevenfold, the Ultimate, and God the Absolute are experiential deities. Let's leave God the Sevenfold for the moment. The Universal Father is engaged in augmenting deity. Having started with 3, he is adding 3. And all of these expressions of deity are experiential. They have origins, historic origins. They have beginnings. They know growth. They know setbacks, if you please. As the Supreme Being is growing in time and space, I would say the Lucifer rebellion is like a cancer taking place within the Supreme. And if you'll recall, they isolated the system of Satania, much as white leukocytes would wall off an infection in the human body. The Supreme Being is finite deity, is growing deity. The Supreme Being compensates God for the lack of experience of never having been finite. Through the Supreme, God can know what it would be like to have an origin and to grow. The Supreme Being compensates man for his inability ever really to understand an infinite God. We're told that God is the first truth and the last fact. We first feel God's love, and then we seek to understand Him. But that quest will never end. There are only two beings who understand God, and that's the Eternal Son and the Infinite Spirit. They can because they have infinite comprehension capacity. We will never understand God, but we will someday understand the Supreme Being, because He has an origin, He has a growth, He has a destiny. He can achieve completion, even as man has an origin, a growth, and can achieve the fulfillment of destiny in the core of the finality. The Supreme Being is God as He can be understood by finite creatures. The Supreme Being is not the personalization of the Universal Father, but the Supreme Being is the finite equivalent of the personalization of the Paradise Trinity. The Trinity is not a person. But when we want to say, what would the Trinity be like if the Trinity were a person and were finite, this is the Supreme Being. He who has seen the Supreme has seen the equivalent of the finite personalization of the Paradise Trinity. What we say about the Supreme Being in relation to the finite universe, we could say about God the Ultimate in relation to the Master Universe. This is the personification of the Trinity in relation to the Master Universe, and as comprehensible by beings that are more than finite. And someday that will include us. I make this comparison between, well, the papers make this comparison between Jesus and the Supreme Being. As Jesus is the bridge over which man moves from the human level to the finding of God, so the Supreme Being someday will be the bridge over which finite creatures will move to those levels that lie beyond the finite of creature experience, the absonite levels. God the Absolute, they don't say much about God the Absolute, but I once paraphrased those two short paragraphs, and it took, as I recall, 6 typewritten pages to paraphrase them and break them down into what these compact words mean. These statements about God the Absolute are like anchovies. The flavor is packed in very tight. You don't eat anchovies in large quantities. You can dilute these paragraphs with much English, and you still have intriguing concepts. The trouble with God the Absolute is that God the Absolute is both experiential and existential. And the chances are that our dealings with God the Absolute lie on beyond the whole Master Universe. I can see an end to the Supreme. I can see destiny. I can see an end and destiny in the ultimate, although it's almost incomprehensible. But I can see only a beginning to God the Absolute. I can see no end. Going back to God the Sevenfold and to the present days, if you look on page 11, you'll see that this is a deity association. This is 7 levels of deity in action and in time and space. And I strongly suspect that God the Sevenfold will go on functioning after the present universe age in outer space, perhaps in slightly modified associations. But in principle, this is God in action in time and space. These are the beings that we encounter on the Paradise Ascent, starting with Jesus, going on up through the rulers of Orvantan, the Master Spirit of our super universe, and then successively the Spirit, the Son, and the Father. God the Sevenfold breaks down into 3 levels. I always think of the Sevenfold as in three principal subdivisions. 1, 2, and 3 are the supreme creators. They're so defined in the papers. They are not infinite. They're sub-infinite. They're sub-absolute. They're the folks that are out here working in time and space. They're the master spirits, the ancients of days, the creator sons. And we should include the creative spirits with the creator sons. The last three are the three deities of paradise. And in between, the supreme being is growing. As the first three levels collaborate with the last three levels, this is the essence of the growth of the power of the supreme being. And as we participate in this adventure, we make our contribution. I always think of it as when you, let's say that a spiritual act, let's compare it to a physical act because we can understand a physical act. Let the physical act consist of a lifting of a 10-pound or 50-pound weight. What you get is the development of muscles, moral muscles perhaps, in the lifting of the weight. But as you lift the weight, your feet push down, don't they? And that's what the supreme being gets, is the down thrust of all our liftings. These repercuss in him if they're of spiritual character. Section 11 is a very simple section dealing with the three absolutes. It's simple because you can read it without understanding any of it whatsoever. These three absolutes are, in a sense, the potentials out of which future things are drawn. But that's an oversimplification. These three absolutes also function throughout all time and space, transcended time and space, etc. Now, here's what makes their function very difficult to comprehend. Let's consider a child in a given situation. He looks at a green apple and he has hunger, and so he eats without any thought of the consequences of the bellyache. This is a stimulus and a response and a consequence without judgment, without foresight, without anything. An adult looks at the green apple. It looks succulent. The adult forecasts the consequences of eating green apples and decides to pass it up because the adult does not want the bellyache. The adult is not reacting to the stimulus of the present, is he? Yes, his salivary glands may react, his mouth may water. But his reaction has to do with future time, does it not? And with the consequences of his acts. Michael, when he was here on earth as Jesus, lived a life from day to day. He looked ahead. He exhibited rare foresight. When he was pressed to do something prematurely, he said, "But this hour has not yet come." No one ever stampeded him. He was always looking ahead. He was reacting to consequences and to effects, just as the adult looks ahead as compared with a child. These absolutes react in a timeless fashion. When any absolute reacts, this absolute reacts in terms of the eternal past, the eternal present, and the eternal future. Therefore, the reaction of an absolute can never be understood within any frame this side of infinity. Does this make sense? The child couldn't understand why the adult wouldn't eat the green apple. The 12 did not understand why Jesus did not do certain things. The universe administrators are just as mystified by the actions and transactions of the three absolutes. Nobody this side of the paradise deities, I think, comprehends what these absolutes are doing. Because one of them mechanizes everything, another one activates everything, and the third one unifies mechanization and activation.
What is the universe?
That is the function of the universe. They say don't look upon these absolutes as antecedent to God. They're not. Don't look upon these absolutes as being independent of the Trinity. They're not. Although the Trinity deals with some of them only indirectly, but deals with one of them directly. When the Paradise Trinity functions in a total sense, this is the function of the deity absolute. And through the universal absolute, this causes responses in the unqualified absolute. Over on page 15, yes, the unqualified absolute mechanizes, the deity absolute activates, the universal absolute correlates these two, unifies these two. In the full function of the universal absolute, you might as well say there's only one absolute. Page 15 has some of the most difficult English in the papers. And if we will forget what it says there and try and get the flavor of the meaning, we can simply say this. The thing that makes it possible to have God and man in the same universe is the universal absolute, who, like Samson, holds up the temple and keeps the infinity of God from crushing the imperfection of man. The universal absolute's function is to maintain the room in which things can be imperfect in the same universe with a perfect and omnipotent deity. The universal absolute is the prop which God has set up under the room in which he is willing to tolerate imperfection in time. Were it not for the universal absolute, the suggestion is there wouldn't be any room. God would fill all things. I will give you my personal opinion of the universal absolute. The universal absolute is a symbol indicating our inability to find the infinite. The universal absolute is a symbol indicating our inability to find the infinite, God as infinite. This forward closes with a discussion of the Trinities. There are three of them. They point out that the Paradise Trinity is the existential Trinity. The other two are experiential Trinities. The Paradise Trinity has no origin. The other two Trinities have an historic origin, a time of coming into being, a time of coming into full function. The Trinities happen, I think, because of divinity. When God separates things, they've got to reunite in some way. When he achieved threefold personalization as Father, Son, and Spirit, the Trinity became inevitable. This separation could exist only if there were a unification, because deity is one. There could be a threefold personalization only if the three deities were unified in some fashion. This sets a pattern which is followed as reality is expressed on the finite level. All those who participate in this finite expression and perfecting of the finite find themselves in essence reunified as a Trinity, as the first experiential Trinity, the Trinity ultimate. Many beings are involved, but I visualize this as the union of the deity of three groups of beings: the supreme creators, the transcendentalers, the architects of the master universe, and the supreme being. This is not the union of over 1 million personalities. This is a union again of three deities. All of the supreme creators add up to some form of deity manifestation. This is a consequence of their success. It's not difficult for me to visualize the deity expression of the core of the architects of the master universe. And the union of these two with the supreme being, not as a person but as deity, constitutes the first experiential Trinity, the Trinity ultimate. And this is the Trinity which will supplement the acts of the Paradise Trinity in the exploration of the master universe. And the consequence of the full development of the master universe is the formation of the second experiential Trinity, the Trinity Absolute. And the union of all three constitutes the Trinity of Trinities. And that's what the forward means to me.
That's a wonderful explanation.
And that's what the forward means to me.
That's a wonderful explanation.
Turn it off.
Thank you, Bill. Sounds good.
Nice.
Coffee
George
here,
worked tonight.
your cigarette. Yeah.
No, he just run down the hall, y'all are worried, he'll be right back. If he don't come.
Tell us, you know, there's some
Question put is, how can the universal absolute be deity? Well, first of all, we know that it's defined as deity. On page 15, paragraph 1, 2, 3, 4, it's spoken, the universal absolute is spoken of as the potential of the static dynamic deity, functionally realizable, etc. This incomprehensible aspect of deity may be static, potential, and associative. Now, those are the first three levels of deity function. I want to go elsewhere for help, because this is a rough one to try to answer.
Yes, it is.
He's back on two, I think, Bill.
Over on page 1154, we can get a little help. On 1154, they expand their discussion in the foreword on the subject of reality when they're talking about the metamorphosis of the I am, self-distribution of the I am.
Is that indeed in reality?
Yeah, 1154, paragraph 2. It says, in following the chronological portrayal of the origins of reality, there must be a postulated theoretical moment of first volitional expression and first repercussional reaction within the I am. In other words, this is before the circles start to separate. In our attempts to portray the genesis and generation of reality, this stage may be conceived as the self-differentiation of the infinite one from the infinitude. The infinite one being pre-God. The infinitude being pre-unqualified absolute. We've got the infinite one and the infinitude, but the postulation of this dual relationship must always be expanded to a triune concept by the recognition of the eternal continuum of the infinity, the I am. To me, J.B., the universal absolute is a kind of a functional symbolization of the continuation of the infinite. And when you start with that single circle of reality, this is deity. This is not non-deity. Deity takes precedence over non-deity. Non-deity comes into existence only because deity has withdrawn itself. Question?
No.
That's the best explanation I can give you. When you think of the three circles linked together, that middle circle symbolizes the original circle, and as such would be deity. The original circle is not non-deity.
No, that's understandable.
You get non-deity because of the removal of something. This produces non-deity by subtraction. But they're still united. Now you can express this in two ways. Let me draw you another concept symbol. Here I've got three circles linked, and I've got all my three links in the chain surrounded by one circle. We can't find the large circle, but we can symbolize it by considering the middle circle of the three chain link. That's the best explanation I can offer you. I think this. I think if you could ever finalize God the Absolute, I think you'd have one absolute. And then I think the universal absolute would become revealed as the concealed infinite.
Oh.
But I don't think the universal absolute will ever cease to exist, because this would mean we would have reached the end of eternity and the outer edge of infinity. And those are self-contradictory statements. Visualize the Trinity of Trinities. You've got three Trinities on the bottom level. You got three experiential deities on the next level, but one of them is not complete. And as long as God the Absolute is incomplete, the third level is the universal absolute. But if he could ever complete God the Absolute, this would absorb all three absolutes and would experientialize all three. And then I think on the third level you'd have the infinite. To me,
you confused me on a higher plane than it was before.
At least you're going up, Jamie.
I'm still confused.
well, I offer this with great humility. But if this is not the explanation, then I have none to offer. It's the best I can do.
Have you ever
That's a rough
described-
question.
I hope you have sometime described the separation of the circles as 1 and 2.
Say that again, Bert.
Have you ever described the separation of the circles when they're separated as 1 and 2?
Yes. The and itself is a reality. or I've used the expression one and another. And the and itself is a reality, yes. See, JB didn't ask, why is the universal absolute?
I
He said,
understand
why is the
that.
universal absolute deity?
Yes, I
And I
understand.
can understand the association and unification factor,
Yes.
but I can't hardly conceive how it can be deity.
We'll try and conceive it not being deity. That might be the answer.
Well, you see, free will moved clear out in the deity absolute when it left the unqualified. Deity
right.
stopped.
All right, I know that.
This universal absolute is pretty mysterious. I'll have my ignorance better unified when I do my 30th appendix to the story. I haven't done it yet. Question?
Bill, I do have a question. This one crazy, everybody believes the word what you said a while ago, there's a reason for it in my mind, but I don't know why I'm asking. And it had to do when the first separation from absolute deity, which separated from the other, and that seems awfully important.
All right. The question is, which moved away from what?
Yes,
Deity moved.
not the unqualified.
No. The unqualified absolute was left behind. Because the principle, the potential for volition is the essence of the concept of deity.
Deity had to move, the other one couldn't move.
The unqualified absolute is a reactor, not an initiator. The unqualified absolute is the sneezer, not the taker of snuff.
It's awfully important, you might even want it to.
I think it is important. The unqualified absolute is what was left behind when deity moved. Now please remember, all of this is symbolization.
So that we know that.
Yeah.
How about that?
You can argue that this is simultaneous. You can argue it for sequence, and it just makes just as much sense to say it's happening today as that it ever did happen, or that it will happen, or better still, it is an always happening. You see, we're using time language in eternity. Here, in reading these papers, make allowance for the by and large. Now, a statement like this might be made in the papers. The experience of human beings is characterized by birth and death. That's a pretty reasonable statement, isn't it? But it's not 100% true, because fusion might take the place of death. But that's so nearly 100% true that it might be made in the papers as virtually an absolute statement. It's near absolute. We know of two people who probably fused, and there are undoubtedly more, because in the papers on thought adjusters it says most of the adjusters who have taken their subjects to fusion were experienced on your world. Well, that suggests to me more than two. The only two I can put my finger on would be Enoch and Elijah.
I don't know how much from that's out of the Bible.
That's right. Burke was pointing out that it says in the last night, they're talking about absinites. They're beginningless and endless. But God, the ultimate, has a beginning. It doesn't say, though, all absinites are beginningless or endless. It says the absinite level is characterized by this, just as mortal life is characterized by birth and death. Had Jesus been an ordinary person, he would never have died. He'd have fused. About the time he was baptized in the Jordan. And they had to take his adjuster away from him to stop fusion.
I'm glad you said that. I've never been able to understand why his adjuster stood away from him.
Same reason, Wilma, on a planet settled in light and life. When a human being is scheduled for fusion, you know, they warn them ahead of time, he can plea for a stay of execution. He's about halfway through an important job, and they grant him this privilege, but then they detach the adjuster, and he works just as Jesus did.
other words, that's a continuation of the growth of the soul, which we are not cognizant of the growth. And you get on up the ladder way up there, and you have completed. The soul
Yeah.
grows to the point of fusion, but you're not conscious of it.
No, that's right. But you can get a stay of execution. You see, Jesus' life has certain parallels in worlds settled in light and life. A human being might go on and function 5 years as a post-fusion human being, and then report to the Morancha temple. All his friends would be there like a commencement exercise. The adjuster would enter the soul, and whambo, the pyrotechnics take place, and off he is. And what a nice way to go.
Bill, we had some questions on extra divine, and to explain your symbol of the 2 inches and the 1,600 miles.
All right. The term extra divine would refer, I suspect, to the unqualified absolute. Is that correct? Let me check this usage.
That's in that
Page
section.
6, paragraph 14. The unqualified absolute is non-personal, extra-divine, and undeified. Divinity is the characteristic unifying quality of deity. This is not deity. Hence, the unqualified absolute discloses no aspects of divinity.
Extra there does not mean greater than. It means
No, outside of
Outside
divinity.
of.
Yes. It sounds better to say extra divine than undivine. Undivine has a connotation of evil. The unqualified absolute is not evil, but is not in any way related to divinity, per se. Now, the function of the 3 absolutes is related to divinity because the mechanizing function of the unqualified is unified by the universal absolute with the activating function of the deity absolute. So the total absolute is not extra divine, only this aspect of the absolute. Page 4, paragraph 15. No, this is page 14, page 15, paragraph 6, paragraph 4. 1, 2, 6. Paragraph 4, page 15. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Universal absolute.
I can't find extra divine in paragraph 4.
It's over here on 14.
Maybe it's in 6, 1, 2. No. I think that would be my interpretation of the word extra divine. A much better choice than the word undivine.
It's like 5 cents.
It's not antagonistic to divinity.
No, it's outside of.
But it's outside of.
And obviously does not connote greater than.
Yeah. See, this absolute is not personal, has no divinity, is not a creator. And you can't understand it. You can't use fact, truth, experience, revelation, philosophy, or super philosophy, epsonity, to understand it. And that's why I shudder when I glibly explain it. There's a question here about 2 inches versus 1,600 miles, where we're talking about, that must be the firehouse. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the first floor.
Well, I'm using space to symbolize time.
Say that again.
I'm using
good yardstick.
I'm using space to symbolize time. And since our time calculations are even looser than our space calculations, because we have to assume a constant rate, it doesn't mean much. But what I'm saying here is this. In considering our firehouse, You remember we built a 3-story firehouse? We put a center pole down the middle where the firemen slide down. And the purpose of that center pole is to symbolize God, who is contactable on any level of the firehouse. And it's the same God. The only thing that's changed is you. We said if the first story is 2 inches high, then the second story is 1,600 miles high, and the third story has no roof. Which is to say, if creative expansion through 2 inches produces the Supreme Being, it takes 1,600 miles to produce God the Ultimate. And you can start God the Absolute, but there is no roof. You can't finish God the Absolute. This would require an exhaustion of infinity and the completion of eternity. Now, in terms of time calculation, I'll give it to you.
How would it be?
Bertie brought the baby. I'll give it to you in time.
You only used to have that anyway, Bill, and just give us an idea of
All right.
how small the first floor is compared to the second.
We computed, or rather I computed, the age of Orvonton as approximately 40,000 trillions of years.
Well, what are you speaking of there? The age of
The age of Orvonton. It's the age of the superuniverse. I've got some mathematics I can apply here, and if any of you want to check it, it's in Appendix 17 of the study here. Now, that's too big a number to cope with, so I invented a term. I said what we need in time is the equivalent of a light year. If you talked about astronomy in terms of miles, your numbers would become so extraordinarily large that they lose all meaning. So I said, can we get a time unit which is large? And I selected one, the approximate age of the spiral nebula Andronover, which gave origin to our sun. It's a little less than 1 trillion years. So I said, let's call 1 trillion years equals 1 Andronover time unit, or 1 ATU, kind of like BTU, British Thermal Units. So then I said, you can say Orvonton is 40,000 ATUs. That's an easy number to write. And we estimated that the future of Orvonton was another 10,000 ATUs. I've got my reasons.
That is 4/5?
We estimated it's about 80% completed.
4/5, okay.
Give or take. I dropped 3,000 ATUs in my calculation here.
One Andronover, what?
10,000 more to go.
In other words, we said that roughly the second universe age is 50,000 ATUs. Now, we'll just skip the third, fourth, fifth, and fifth universe ages because they are so very small in comparison to the sixth. The universe age, which might possibly apply to the sixth space level, the fourth outer space level, would be 5 trillion ATUs. This thing goes up by an increment of 100, or 10 squared each time. Now, I'm not sure that this calculation is logical. If it is not logical, it errs on the conservative side. I may be off by a matter of 1 exponent per space level. You know what that means, Clyde? I'm going up with a square, and it may go up by the 4th power. I'm not sure. I can determine acceleration, but I cannot determine that whether the acceleration is constant or accelerating, because I've only got 2 points I can compute. So, if the first level of the firehouse is 50,000 ATUs, then the second level is more than 5 trillion ATUs, because I've ignored all the intervening times. I've just picked the last one, because the last one dwarfs everything before it. See, 5 trillion is so much bigger than 50 billion, 500 million, or 5 million ATUs. I suspect that these numbers are far too small.
But you have good figures for your 50,000 ATUs.
Well, I'll give it to you.
Yeah, cut it.
Yeah, that gave origin to our
Just
sun.
taking the word Andronomer.
Yeah. It's just a little under 1 trillion years. Now, if you'd like this math, those of you who don't like math, just turn off your hearing aids. I'll take you through it very quickly. Here is my reasoning from the papers, and it's kind of fun to go through it. We know that Michael arrived in Nebadon about 400 billion years ago. Page 1309, paragraph 2. We know that on page 392, paragraphs 1 and 3, when the Verandadeks had been created, then the Lananadeks were created, and exactly 12 million were brought into being. That means all Lananadeks are approximately the same age. We can deduce the Lananadeks were created after 400 billion years ago, and they were all created at the same time. Page 654, paragraph 3. 200 billion years ago, Andronover, that's our nebula, entered upon another stage of its physical evolution. The oldest inhabited world in the local universe dates from this time. That's the whole local universe, 200 billion years ago. Deduction. Lananadeks were created before 200 billion years ago. They function as system sovereigns and as planetary princes, and they would have to be functional before there could be any inhabited world. So now we've got them bracketed. After 400 billion, but before 200 billion years ago. Page 618, paragraph 3. Subjective time is relative. Take the case of Lucifer. 3 days of his long life would be like 300,000 years of human life on Urantia. But 3 days to Lucifer would be like 2 1/2 seconds in terms of life on Uversa, the capital of Orvanta. Deduction. 3 days in the life of Lucifer is proportional to 2 1/2 seconds in the life of a very old native of Uversa, a hypothetical abandanter. They're natives of Uversa. We may now begin our calculation of the age of a very old native of Uversa by determining the ratio of 2 1/2 seconds to 3 days. There are 3,600 seconds in an hour and 72 hours in 3 days. If we multiply 3,600 by 72, the product is 259,200. This is the number of seconds in 3 days. If we divide 2 1/2 into 259,200, the quotient is 103,680. We can now establish a ratio of 1 to 103,680 as indicative of the relationship of the lifespan of a very old native of Nebadon to a very old native of Ubersa. Are you with me? Now, just how old is Lucifer? Or any Lenonondeck for that matter? We know that all Lenonondecks were created at the same time, and that this time falls between two known dates, after 400 billion years ago and before 200 billion years ago. We elect to assume that the age of the Nebadon Lenonondecks dates from a time midway between these two dates. We assume that our Lenonondecks were all created 300 billion years ago. It's the best assumption you can make. What's the difference? We are now in position to complete our ratio. 1 is to 103,680, as 300 billion years is to the age of a very old native of Ubersa. If we multiply 300 billion years and the factor 103,680, the product is 31,104,000 of billions of years. Let us round this number off to an even 30 million billions of years. This is the age of our hypothetical Ubersa Abundanter. We can otherwise express this number as 30,000 trillions of years, or 30,000 ATUs. It is a number equal to 30 times 10 to the 15th power. The physical age of Andrometer, a component nebula of our local universe, is just under 1 trillion years. We can accordingly state that our Ubersa Abundanter is around 30,000 times as old as Andromeda. Then we figure that the local universe, the super universe, had a head start before there were any Abundanters, so we pick up another 10,000, and we figure it's got 10,000 units to go, so there's our 50,000. Units to go, so there's our 50,000. There's the calculation.
On what basis do you presume the last 10,000?
Oh, it's a series of, I make a whole series of calculations here. First of all, I compute the registry number of Urantia in relation to 7 trillion. Our registry number is 5 1/3 odd trillion. So I can say that we get 76% of our inhabited worlds, taking all 7 super universes. Then I compute the number of our creator suns, 611,121 to 700,000. So I get me a percentage of 87%, which is much higher. I compute the number of our circuit supervisor, 572,000 to 700,000, and I get an 82%. Well, to summarize all this,
Those three figures are good enough to average 80%.
well, I got a bunch of them here. 76% of the inhabited worlds have developed human life. 81% of 100,000 census directors of Orvantan have been assigned. 82% of a projected 700,000 tertiary circuit supervisors have been assigned.
I'm convinced.
85% of a projected 100,000 secondary supervisors have been assigned, and 87% of a projected 700,000 assignable creator sons. All right.
I'll buy it.
Then I when I got my ATUs, I simply applied my space magnitudes to time.